This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this exploration of the Pahlavi Dynasty, a pivotal chapter in Iran's modern history. From 1925 to 1979, two Shahs, Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza Shah, transformed Iran through ambitious modernization programs, sweeping social reforms, and complex relationships with global powers. In this narration, we'll journey through 5 decades that saw Iran evolve from a traditional society into a modern nation-state, examining the dynasty's achievements, controversies, and ultimate downfall in the Islamic Revolution. Join us as we uncover the legacy of a royal house that forever changed the face of Iran. Chapter 1. The Making of the Pahlavi Dynasty. Persia in the early 20th century was not a sovereign nation in any meaningful sense. It was a chessboard where foreign powers played their games, and the Qajar dynasty that nominally ruled had long since become a hollow shell of authority. The country that had once been the center of vast empires, from the Achaemenids to the Safavids, had been reduced to what historians would later call a semi-colonial state. The British and Russians did not need to formally colonize Iran, as they had done with India or Central Asia. They found it far more convenient to maintain the fiction of Persian independence while extracting everything of value through concessions, loans, and direct interference in governance. By 1920, the situation had become absurd. British forces occupied the south, protecting their oil interests through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Soviet forces controlled the north, having swept in during the chaos of their civil war. Between these two zones of occupation, the Qajar government in Tehran exercised authority over little more than the capital itself. Tribal confederations ruled their territories as independent fiefdoms. Bandits operated with impunity on major roads. The treasury was empty, looted by corrupt officials and drained by debt payments to foreign banks. The young Shah, Ahmad Shah Qajar, spent more time in Europe than in his own palace, seemingly content to watch his inheritance crumble from the comfort of Parisian cafes. This was the Iran into which a 42-year-old officer named Reza Khan stepped to seize power in February 1921. His story reads like an improbable fiction, the kind of tale that would be dismissed as melodramatic if it were not meticulously documented in British diplomatic cables and Persian newspapers. Here was a man born in Alasht village in 1878, orphaned at 8 months when his father Abbas Ali Khan died, leaving him to be raised first by his uncle, then by Amir Taman Kazım Khan, a Cossack brigade officer. His mother, Nosha Farin Iramlu, was a Georgian immigrant whose family had fled after the Russo-Persian Wars. At 25, he was so humble that he served as guard and servant to the Dutch consul Fridolin Marinus Knobel in Tehran. He had no aristocratic lineage, no family wealth, no obvious path to power. Yet, through pure military competence, he had risen. He joined the Persian Cossack Brigade as a teenager sometime around 1892 or 1893 and spent the next quarter century learning the trade of arms. He was good at it. By 1911, he had achieved the rank of first lieutenant, distinguishing himself in operations against rebels who sought to overthrow the constitutional government and restore the absolute monarchy. His skill with machine guns earned him promotion to the equivalent of captain by 1912. He continued to rise, becoming a colonel by 1915. The Persian Cossack Brigade itself was a curious institution, created in the late 19th century and trained by Russian officers. It was the closest thing Iran had to a modern military force, though even this was compromised by foreign control. But skill alone does not make history. Reza Khan might have remained an obscure military officer, retiring on a modest pension, had the strategic situation not shifted dramatically after the First World War. The Russian Revolution of 1917 threw the entire regional order into chaos. Russian forces in northern Iran withdrew or went rogue. The new Bolshevik government repudiated the old Tsarist spheres of influence, but this created a vacuum that was quickly filled by communist revolutionaries and separatist movements. By 1920, a Soviet-backed Persian Socialist Soviet Republic had been declared in Gilan province, and Soviet troops had occupied much of the Caspian coast. The British, having just finished one world war, were in no mood for another. But they also could not allow Iran to fall entirely under Bolshevik influence. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company's installations in the south were too valuable, and the strategic position of Iran as a buffer between Soviet Russia and British India was too important. Yet maintaining a large military occupation was expensive and politically unpopular in London. What the British needed was a strong man who could stabilize Iran, crush the communist insurgency, and be reliable enough to protect British interests without requiring constant hand-holding. General Edmund Ironside, commander of British forces in Iran, thought he had found his man in Reza Khan. As Ironside would later write to the British War Office, a capable Persian officer was in command of the Cossacks, and this would solve many difficulties and enable us to depart in peace and honor. On January 14, 1921, Ironside promoted Reza Khan to lead the entire Persian Cossack Brigade, which was based in Qazvin province northwest of Tehran. This was an extraordinary leap, elevating a colonel to command an entire force numbering several thousand men. The promotion was entirely a British decision, made without consultation with the Persian government. It was the first clear signal that something was about to happen. Exactly 1 month later, on February 14, 1921, Reza Khan marched on Tehran with a force estimated at between 3,000 and 4,000 Cossack troops. The march itself was relatively bloodless. The government forces that might have resisted simply melted away. By the time Reza Khan's column reached the capital, resistance was token at best. Within days, the existing government had collapsed. The Prime Minister fled. The cabinet dissolved. Here, the standard narrative of military coups would have the coup leader seize power directly, perhaps declaring himself dictator or president. Reza Khan was shrewder than that. He understood that Iran, despite its weakness, had a constitutional tradition dating to the Constitutional Revolution of 1906. The Majlis, Iran's parliament, had real legitimacy in the eyes of educated Persians and foreign observers. An outright military dictatorship would invite opposition and foreign intervention. Instead, Reza Khan installed a civilian politician named Zia-ul-Din Tabatabai as prime minister, while taking for himself the positions of Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief of the Army. This arrangement satisfied several constituencies. The British got their strongman in effective control of the military. Constitutional reformers got the appearance of civilian rule. Reza Khan got the reality of power without its diplomatic complications. For the next 2 years, he used this position to methodically secure his grip on the country. He crushed the Soviet-backed Gilan Republic with brutal efficiency. He brought recalcitrant tribal leaders to heel, either through negotiation backed by credible military threat or through direct military action when negotiation failed. He improved the efficiency of tax collection, which had the dual benefit of filling state coffers and demonstrating state capacity. The political arrangement with Zia-ul-Din Tabatabai, however, could not last. Zia had expected that as prime minister he would wield real authority. He quickly discovered that Reza Khan had no intention of relinquishing military control. The sight of Reza Khan appearing at government meetings in his military uniform, surrounded by armed officers, made the power dynamics unmistakably clear. When push came to shove, Zia had speeches and legal authority. Reza Khan had the Persian Cossack Brigade. By October 1923, Reza Khan had maneuvered Zia out of office and taken the position of prime minister for himself. He was now both commander of the army and head of government, a combination that gave him dictatorial powers in all but name. The young Ahmad Shah, watching these developments from Europe, made a fateful decision. He chose not to return to Iran to assert his authority. Perhaps he understood that asserting authority would require confronting Reza Khan militarily, a confrontation he would certainly lose. Perhaps he simply preferred the comforts of exile to the dangers of royal duty. Whatever his reasoning, his absence from Iran during this critical period sealed the fate of the Qajar dynasty. With Ahmad Shah in Europe and Reza Khan in control of both the military and civilian government, the question of the monarchy's future became unavoidable. Reza Khan initially considered declaring Iran a republic on the model of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's Turkey. In November 1919, he had already chosen the surname Pahlavi, reaching back to the Middle Persian language of the Sasanian Empire, signaling dynastic ambitions even before the coup. The idea of a republic had considerable appeal among secular modernizers who saw monarchy as inherently backwards. But it ran into two immovable obstacles. The first was British opposition. The British preferred monarchies to republics, considering them more stable and predictable. More importantly, the British feared that a Persian republic would inspire republican sentiment in neighboring Iraq, which Britain had just established as a monarchy under King Faisal. The second obstacle was the Shia clergy, who viewed republicanism as dangerously secular and feared that a republic would attack religious institutions even more aggressively than a monarchy might. Faced with this opposition, Reza Khan pivoted. If he could not be president of a republic, he would be Shah of a new dynasty. The legal mechanism was the Majlis. In October 1925, the parliament voted to formally depose Ahmad Shah Qajar and dissolve the Qajar dynasty. This was constitutionally questionable at best. Ahmad Shah had not formally abdicated, and deposing a dynasty that had ruled for over a century set a precedent that undermined the principle of hereditary monarchy itself. But these legal niceties seemed irrelevant given the reality of power. The Majlis that voted for deposition did so in a Tehran controlled by Reza Khan's army. The deputies understood perfectly well that this was not really a vote, but a ratification of accomplished facts. On December 12, 1925, the Majlis declared Reza Khan to be Reza Shah Pahlavi, the first monarch of a new dynasty. The coronation itself took place on April 25, 1926, at the Gulistan Palace in Tehran. It was a ceremony of extraordinary grandeur, designed to project power and permanence. Reza Shah wore a crown studded with more than 3,000 diamonds, emeralds, and pearls. He sat on the peacock throne, that legendary seat that had been looted from India by the Safavid Shah Nader centuries earlier. Foreign dignitaries attended, giving the event international recognition. His 6-year-old son, Mohammad Reza, was proclaimed crown prince, establishing the succession and the dynasty's claim to perpetuity. Yet for all the pageantry, everyone present understood that this was not a traditional coronation in the mold of ancient Persian emperors or even recent Qajar Shahs. Reza Shah had not inherited the throne through bloodline. He had not received it through divine mandate or popular acclamation. He had seized it through military force, maneuvered it through parliamentary procedure, and secured it through British acquiescence. His legitimacy was entirely modern and entirely pragmatic. He was Shah because he commanded the army, controlled the government, and no one else could challenge him. This origin would profoundly shape the character of Pahlavi rule. Unlike dynasties that could rely on centuries of tradition and religious sanction, the Pahlavi dynasty would always need to prove its legitimacy through performance. This meant modernization, development, and the visible projection of state power. It meant grand projects like the Trans-Iranian Railway, the establishment of a secular education system, and ambitious economic programs. But it also meant an authoritarian intolerance for opposition and a paranoid fear that what had been seized by force could be lost the same way. The parties involved in this transformation of Iran from Qajar twilight to Pahlavi dawn reveal much about the nature of power in the early 20th century Middle East. The British played the role of kingmaker, calculating that a strong centralized Iran under a reliably pro-British Shah served their strategic interests better than a weak, divided country vulnerable to Soviet influence. General Ironside's promotion of Reza Khan was not simply recognizing talent. It was a conscious decision to elevate a tool of British policy. Reza Khan himself was the quintessential military strongman, a type that would become all too familiar throughout the 20th century in the post-colonial world. He saw disorder and imposed order through force. He saw backwardness and imposed modernization through decree. He saw foreign domination and asserted independence, though his independence was always constrained by the reality that British support had been crucial to his rise and remained important to his survival. The Qajar dynasty, in its final representative Ahmad Shah, demonstrated the fatal weakness of a ruling house that had lost all legitimacy with its people and all leverage with foreign powers. Ahmad Shah's choice to remain in Europe during the crisis of 1921 to 1925 was not simply personal cowardice, though it may have been that too. It was an implicit acknowledgement that the Qajar claim to rule had become purely nominal. When the Majlis voted to depose him, barely anyone in Iran cared enough to object. The Majlis itself played the role of legitimizing institution, providing constitutional cover for what was fundamentally a military takeover. The deputies who voted to end the Qajar dynasty and crown Reza Khan were not acting as independent legislators exercising free judgment. They were responding to the military and political realities around them, giving legal form to the outcome that force had already determined. This pattern of parliaments ratifying rather than deliberating would characterize much of 20th century Iranian politics. The Shia clergy emerged as a conservative force skeptical of both Republican radicalism and of Reza Khan's secular ambitions, but ultimately unable to prevent the transition. Their opposition to a republic helped channel Reza Khan toward monarchy, but it did not give them control over the new monarchy. Within a few years, Reza Shah would prove himself one of the most aggressively secular rulers Iran had ever known, attacking clerical power and privilege with a determination that shocked many who had expected a more traditional relationship between throne and mosque. What made this transition historically significant was not just the change of dynasty, though that was dramatic enough. It was the establishment of a new model of rule that would define Iran until 1979. The Pahlavi state would be centralized, where the Qajar state had been fragmented. It would be militarized, where the Qajar state had been ceremonial. It would pursue modernization as state policy, where the Qajar state had allowed modernization to happen haphazardly, if at all. And, crucially, it would be dependent on foreign powers, even as it proclaimed independence, a dependency that began with British support for Reza Khan's coup and would continue in different forms throughout the dynasty's existence. The British got what they wanted in the short term. The communist threat in the north was crushed. The tribal chaos was brought under control. British oil interests were protected. A strong central government emerged that could negotiate with foreign powers and enforce agreements. But in creating this strong centralized state, the British also created something they could not fully control. Reza Shah would prove to be more than just a British puppet. He would pursue Iranian nationalist policies that sometimes conflicted with British interests. He would seek to balance British influence with German technical assistance in the 1930s. He would push back against the Anglo-Persian oil companies' exploitation of Iranian oil resources. This fundamental tension between the Pahlavi dynasty's dependence on foreign support and its aspiration to genuine independence would never be resolved. It would pass from Reza Shah to his son Mohammad Reza Shah, from British patronage to American patronage, from the 1921 coup to the 1953 coup. The dynasty that began with a British-orchestrated march on Tehran would end 54 years later with an American decision to withdraw support as the Shah's government collapsed in revolution. But in 1926, at the coronation of Reza Shah Pahlavi, such an end seemed impossibly distant. The new Shah was at the height of his power, master of an army that had just proven its capacity to impose order, leader of a state apparatus that was beginning to extend control into regions that had never known effective central government. The peacock throne had a new occupant, the Pahlavi Dynasty had been born, and Iran was about to experience a forced march into modernity that would transform the country in ways both profound and profoundly destabilizing. The parties who had brought this new dynasty into being, from British generals to Persian parliament members to the Shah himself, could not have foreseen where their actions would ultimately lead. They had solved the immediate crisis of Qajar collapse and post-war chaos, but in doing so, they had set in motion dynamics that would shape Iranian history for generations, creating a state powerful enough to suppress opposition, but never legitimate enough to command genuine loyalty. Modern in form, but authoritarian in practice. Independent in rhetoric, but dependent in reality.
Chapter 2. Mossadegh's Overthrow. The young man who ascended to the peacock throne in September 1941 was nothing like his father. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was 21 years old, educated in Switzerland at an exclusive boarding school, soft-spoken where his father had been domineering, hesitant where Reza Shah had been decisive. He had been groomed for power his entire life, proclaimed crown prince at the age of 6 during his father's coronation, yet he seemed utterly unprepared for the brutal realities of ruling Iran. His accession came not through natural succession, but through foreign invasion and his father's forced abdication. British and Soviet forces had occupied Iran in August 1941, ostensibly to secure supply routes to the Soviet Union and prevent Nazi influence in the region, but also to punish Reza Shah for his increasingly close ties with Germany. The old Shah was given a choice between abdication and deposition. He chose abdication and was sent into exile, eventually dying in Johannesburg in 1944, his body remaining abroad until it could be returned years later for burial in the mausoleum he had built. Mohammad Reza Shah inherited a country under occupation and a throne whose authority had been thoroughly compromised. The Allied forces did not depose the monarchy entirely because they found it useful as a fig leaf of continuity and legitimacy, but they made clear that the new Shah would rule only at their sufferance. British and Soviet officials interfered openly in Iranian politics, supporting favored politicians and vetoing those they found inconvenient. The young Shah learned a lesson in those early years that would shape his entire reign. His throne depended ultimately not on the loyalty of his subjects, but on the support of foreign powers.
The occupation transformed Iranian politics in ways that would have been unthinkable under Reza Shah's iron rule. Political prisoners were released from jails. Newspapers that had been banned began publishing again. The Majlis, which had been reduced to a rubber stamp under Reza Shah, began to exercise real legislative authority. Political parties formed across the ideological spectrum, from monarchists to communists. The Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh, grew rapidly in membership and influence, particularly in the north where Soviet occupation forces provided protection and encouragement. For a brief period, from 1941 to 1953, Iran experienced something approaching genuine parliamentary democracy, an experiment that would end in spectacular failure and foreign intervention. The central issue that would define this period and ultimately destroy it was oil. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which had been renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1935, controlled all of Iran's petroleum resources through a concession that had been negotiated in 1933 under terms extraordinarily favorable to Britain. The company paid Iran a pittance in royalties while earning vast profits. British workers at the oil facilities in the south lived in comfortable company towns with swimming pools and air conditioning, while Iranian workers lived in squalor. The inequality was not just economic, but racial, a colonial hierarchy transplanted onto Iranian soil.
Every barrel of oil extracted from Iranian territory enriched Britain's treasury and fueled its economy, while Iran remained impoverished despite sitting atop one of the world's largest petroleum reserves.
Into this volatile situation stepped Mohammad Mossadegh, a figure who seemed conjured from a different era of Iranian politics. He came from Qajar aristocracy, his mother a granddaughter of a Qajar crown prince, and he had been educated in Europe, earning a doctorate in law from Switzerland. This made him Iran's first European-educated lawyer with a PhD, a credential that carried enormous prestige. But unlike many of the westernized Iranian elite who collaborated with foreign powers, Mossadegh was a fierce nationalist who believed Iran's resources belonged to Iranians. He had opposed Reza Shah's dictatorship and had been sidelined during that period. Now, in the more open political environment of the 1940s, he emerged as the leader of the National Front, a coalition dedicated to reducing foreign influence and asserting Iranian sovereignty. Mossadegh's political philosophy was straightforward and radical for its time. He argued that Iran would never be truly independent as long as its most valuable resource was controlled by a foreign company that paid the Iranian government a fraction of the profits. He called for nationalization of the oil industry, a proposal that electrified Iranian public opinion. Students rallied in the streets chanting nationalist slogans. The bazaar merchants, traditionally conservative, supported him because they saw British economic dominance as stifling Iranian commerce. Even many clerics backed him, viewing the Anglo-Iranian oil company as a tool of imperialist exploitation. The Majlis elected Mossadegh as Prime Minister in 1951, and he immediately moved to implement nationalization. On March 15, 1951, the Majlis voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. It was a moment of extraordinary national unity. The bill passed with support from across the political spectrum, from leftist Tudeh members to nationalist reformers to some religious conservatives. The young Shah, politically weak and aware of the overwhelming popular support for nationalization, signed the bill into law. For the first time in modern Iranian history, an elected civilian leader had successfully asserted Iranian control over Iranian resources against a great power. Britain's reaction was one of shock and fury. The Labour government of Clement Attlee, despite its socialist credentials, proved just as committed to protecting British imperial interests as any conservative administration would have been. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was not just a commercial concern. It was a pillar of the British economy, and its refineries at Abadan were among the largest in the world. The British government owned a controlling stake in the company. Losing control of Iranian oil meant losing both immediate revenue and long-term strategic leverage over a crucial resource.
The British tried multiple approaches to reverse nationalization. They imposed an embargo, refusing to buy Iranian oil and pressuring other countries not to purchase it either. British technicians withdrew from the oil fields, hoping that Iranians would be unable to operate the complex facilities alone and would be forced to negotiate Britain's return. They took the dispute to the International Court of Justice at The Hague, arguing that nationalization violated the terms of the concession. They brought the matter before the United Nations Security Council. But Mossadegh proved to be a skilled diplomat and propagandist. He traveled to The Hague and New York, presenting Iran's case not as a mere contractual dispute, but as a fundamental question of national sovereignty and the rights of nations to control their own resources. At the United Nations, Mossadegh gave a speech that resonated far beyond Iran. He told the Security Council that Iran's greatest national resource was oil, that this resource should provide work and sustenance for the Iranian people, that its exploitation should be Iran's national industry, and that revenue from it should improve Iranian living conditions. It was a simple argument, but a powerful one, particularly for the growing number of post-colonial nations that were watching closely to see whether a weak country could stand up to a great power and survive. For a time, it seemed that Iran might succeed. The International Court of Justice ruled that it lacked jurisdiction over the dispute, a victory for Iran. The Security Council took no action. The oil embargo hurt the Iranian economy, but Mossadegh's government survived through a combination of austerity measures and alternative revenue sources. Iranian technicians, contrary to British expectations, proved capable of running the oil facilities. The crisis demonstrated that Iran could function without British overlordship. But Mossadegh's success in defying Britain created a new problem. It brought him into direct conflict with the young Shah. The constitutional structure of Iran created a dual authority, with the Shah as head of state and the Prime Minister as head of government. Under a strong Shah like Reza Shah, the Prime Minister was clearly subordinate. Under a weak Shah and a strong Prime Minister, the balance shifted dramatically. Mossadegh began to assert parliamentary control over traditionally royal prerogatives, particularly the military. In 1952, Mossadegh demanded the authority to appoint his own Minister of War, a power that the Shah viewed as essential to his control of the army. When the Shah refused, Mossadegh resigned, a calculated political move that triggered massive street protests in Tehran. Crowds filled the streets demanding Mossadegh's return. The military governor of Tehran attempted to suppress the demonstrations but found the crowds overwhelming. Facing the prospect of civil unrest spinning out of control, the Shah backed down and reinstated Mossadegh, granting him the power to appoint the war minister.
This was the critical moment. The Shah had been forced by popular pressure to cede control of the military to an elected prime minister. The implications were revolutionary. Iran was evolving into something approaching a genuine constitutional monarchy where the Shah would reign but the elected government would rule. For nationalists and Democrats, this was the culmination of the constitutional revolution of 1906. For the Shah and his supporters, it was an existential threat to the monarchy. For foreign powers watching from London and Washington, it was deeply alarming. The British had been working since 1951 to orchestrate Mossadegh's overthrow, but they lacked the capability to do it alone. The withdrawal of British influence in Iran during Mossadegh's premiership meant they no longer had the networks and leverage to stage a successful coup. They needed American help. Initially, the Truman administration in Washington had been unsympathetic to British complaints, viewing the dispute as a remnant of colonialism that Britain needed to resolve through negotiation rather than subversion. But when Dwight Eisenhower became president in January 1953, the geopolitical calculation changed. Eisenhower's administration viewed the world through the lens of the Cold War. The key figure shaping their Iran policy was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, Director of Central Intelligence. The Dulles brothers saw communist expansion as the defining threat of their era, and they were prepared to use covert action as a tool of American power in ways that Truman had been reluctant to embrace. British intelligence persuaded the Americans that Mossadegh, though not himself a communist, was creating conditions where communists could take power. They pointed to the Tudeh party's growing influence, to Mossadegh's occasional tactical cooperation with Tudeh, and to the chaos of economic crisis caused by the oil embargo. The argument was that if Mossadegh was not removed, Iran would follow China and Eastern Europe into the communist camp, giving the Soviet Union control over the Middle East's oil resources. Whether the Dulles brothers genuinely believed this analysis or simply found it convenient is unclear. What is clear is that they authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to work with British MI6 to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah's absolute power. The operation was codenamed TP Ajax by the CIA and Operation Boot by MI6. It would become one of the most infamous covert actions of the Cold War era. The architect of the operation on the American side was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, a senior CIA officer who had been working in the Middle East. Roosevelt traveled to Tehran in mid-1953 and began organizing a network of military officers, politicians, and street thugs who could be mobilized against Mossadegh. The plan involved bribing members of the Majlis to turn against the Prime Minister, paying newspaper editors to publish anti-Mossadegh propaganda, and recruiting military commanders willing to stage a coup.
Most crucially, it required the Shah's cooperation. Without the monarch's authority, a coup against an elected prime minister would lack even the veneer of legality. The Shah, however, proved to be a problem. Despite his hatred of Mossadegh and fear of losing his throne, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was indecisive and afraid. He understood that if a coup failed, he would likely be deposed or killed. Roosevelt met with him repeatedly, urging him to sign royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a new prime minister, General Fazlollah Zahedi, who was cooperating with the coup plotters. The Shah wavered, changed his mind, made excuses, and delayed. His sister, Princess Ashraf, far more determined and politically ruthless than her twin brother, traveled to Tehran from Europe specifically to push him to act. Still, he hesitated.
Finally, on August 13, 1953, the Shah signed the decrees. A military officer was sent to deliver the dismissal order to Mossadegh. But someone had leaked information about the coup, and Mossadegh's supporters were ready. Crowds loyal to the prime minister surrounded the officer and arrested him. The coup appeared to have failed before it truly began. In panic, the Shah fled Iran with his wife Soraya, flying first to Baghdad and then to Rome. Once again, a Pahlavi monarch had abandoned his throne and his country when faced with a political crisis. What happened next has been endlessly debated and analyzed. On August 19, 1953, just 6 days after the failed first attempt, a second coup succeeded. Crowds appeared in the streets of Tehran, some genuinely opposed to Mossadegh, others hired and organized by coup plotters with CIA and MI6 money. Military units that had been wavering now moved against the government. Tanks rolled toward Mossadegh's residence. Fighting broke out between pro-Mossadegh forces and coup supporters. By the end of the day, street battles had killed protesters, soldiers, and civilians across Tehran, though exact numbers remained disputed. Mossadegh was under arrest, and General Zahedi was declaring himself prime minister. The Shah, hearing news of the coup's success in Rome, flew back to Tehran in triumph. He returned not as the uncertain young monarch who had fled days earlier, but as a ruler determined never again to allow civilian politicians to threaten his power. Mossadegh was put on trial in a military court, convicted of treason, and sentenced to 3 years in prison followed by house arrest. He would remain under house arrest at his family estate in Ahmedabad until his death in 1967, never granted freedom again. The democratic moment was over. The National Front was banned. The Tudeh party was crushed in a wave of arrests that swept up over 4,000 members. Of these, 477 were in the armed forces. 40 were executed, another 14 died under torture, and over 200 were sentenced to life imprisonment. Those who had supported constitutional democracy and Iranian sovereignty over oil resources found themselves jailed, exiled, or driven underground. The consequences of the 1953 coup would reverberate through Iranian history for decades. Most immediately, it restored absolute power to the Shah and ended the brief democratic experiment. It also resolved the oil dispute, but on terms that gave Britain far less than it had originally demanded, while bringing American oil companies into Iran for the first time. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was dissolved and replaced by an international consortium in which American companies held 40%, British companies 40%, and Dutch and French companies split the remaining 20%. Iran's nationalization was maintained in theory, with the National Iranian Oil Company retaining nominal ownership of the oil fields. But the consortium controlled production and marketing through a 25-year agreement. Iran would receive 50% of profits, better than the old British concession, but far less than the full control Mossadegh had envisioned. For the Shah, the coup was salvation, but also permanent illegitimacy. He had not returned through the will of the Iranian people or constitutional process, but through foreign intervention. Everyone in Iran knew it. The CIA's role was poorly disguised and became common knowledge within weeks. The coup had rescued the monarchy, but it had poisoned any possibility of genuine popular support. This taint of foreign dependence would mark the dynasty until its end. The parties involved in this intervention each had their reasons, and each bore responsibility for the outcome. The British initiated the coup out of imperial arrogance and economic greed, unable to accept that a weak nation could assert sovereignty over resources on its own territory. The Americans executed it out of Cold War paranoia and a willingness to sacrifice democratic principles for strategic advantage. The Shah cooperated out of personal ambition and fear, choosing autocratic power backed by foreigners over any risk of genuine constitutional monarchy. Conservative Iranian politicians and military officers joined the coup out of class interests and ideological opposition to Mossadegh's populist nationalism. Mossadegh himself bears examination as a tragic figure who came extraordinarily close to succeeding but ultimately failed. His strengths were his integrity, his nationalist credentials, and his political courage. He was genuinely incorruptible in a political system rotten with corruption. He truly believed in Iranian sovereignty and constitutional government. He was willing to stand up to the world's greatest powers when conventional wisdom said it was impossible. But he also made critical errors. He underestimated how far Britain and America would go to prevent his success. He failed to build sufficient support within the military to defend against a coup. He relied too heavily on street mobilization and popular support, not understanding that popular support could be manufactured and manipulated by those with sufficient resources. Perhaps most critically, he pushed his confrontation with the Shah too far, creating a binary choice between his democratic vision and the monarchy itself, when a more tactful approach might have secured the substance of his goals while preserving the form of royal authority. The coup of 1953 established the template that would define Iran for the next 25 years. A Shah ruling with absolute power, backed by American military aid and political support, facing permanent opposition that viewed him as fundamentally illegitimate. The Pahlavi Dynasty had been rescued through American intervention, just as it had been created through British intervention 32 years earlier. The pattern of foreign dependence was now complete. The throne would never stand on its own. When the Americans withdrew their support a quarter-century later, the dynasty would fall with the same speed it had been restored. Chapter 3. The White Revolution's Hollow Promise. The Shah, who returned to Tehran from Rome in August 1953, understood that his restoration had been an act of foreign intervention, not national will. Everyone knew it. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi sat on a throne that had been given back to him by the CIA, and this fundamental fact poisoned any claim to legitimate authority. A monarch who rules by divine right or ancient tradition or even popular consent can afford to be ineffective. A monarch who rules because American intelligence services put him there must constantly prove he deserves to stay. This existential insecurity drove everything that followed. The Shah needed development that was visible, reforms that were dramatic, and modernization that transformed Iran in ways that could not be denied. What emerged was the White Revolution, a program of social and economic reform that would define the Pahlavi dynasty's final 2 decades and ultimately contribute to its destruction. The White Revolution was announced in January 1963. The name itself was deliberate propaganda, positioning the Shah's reforms as a revolution from the throne that would preempt any revolution from below. The initial program consisted of 6 main points: land reform to break up large estates, nationalization of forests, privatization of state-owned factories, profit sharing for industrial workers, women's suffrage, and creation of a literacy corps to educate rural populations. But the core of the White Revolution, its most ambitious and consequential element, was land reform. Iran's agricultural system in the early 1960s was essentially feudal. A small number of aristocratic families owned vast estates, worked by peasant sharecroppers who had no land of their own and lived in conditions of desperate poverty. These landlords were politically powerful, dominating the majlis and using their wealth to influence government policy. They were also deeply conservative, opposing modernization and secularization that might threaten their traditional privileges. For the Shah, they represented both a political threat and an obstacle to development. The land reform law passed in 1962 forced landlords to sell holdings above a certain size to the government, which would then redistribute the land to peasant cultivators. Families that had held estates for generations found their property confiscated with minimal compensation. Hundreds of thousands of peasant families received title to land they had worked for their entire lives. On paper, it looked like the most progressive social reform in Iranian history. The reality was catastrophic. Many of the redistributed plots were too small to be economically viable. A family that had survived as sharecroppers on a large estate, using its resources and irrigation infrastructure, could not survive as independent farmers on 5 or 10 hectares of marginal land. The old landlords had provided credit, tools, and access to markets. The new smallholders had none of these things. Government support programs were inadequate and corruption-ridden. Within a few years, many of the newly created small farmers were abandoning their land and migrating to cities. This rural displacement happened on a massive scale. Tehran's population exploded from about 2 million in 1960 to over 4 million by 1975. Other cities saw similar growth. The migrants settled in sprawling slums on the urban periphery, places with minimal infrastructure and no real economic opportunities. They had been uprooted from traditional village communities where, however poor they might have been, they at least had social networks and cultural continuity. Now they lived in shantytowns as an urban proletariat, disconnected from both rural tradition and urban modernity, with nothing to anchor their identity except resentment. The Shah and his technocratic advisors never fully grasped what they had done. They saw the land reform statistics and declared success. They did not see the unintended consequences, the destruction of rural social structures, the creation of an angry, displaced population. Land reform was supposed to create a grateful peasant class loyal to the throne. Instead, it created rootless urban masses who would eventually form the shock troops of revolution. The other signature element of the White Revolution was the extension of political rights to women. Women received the right to vote and to stand for election to the Majlis. Educational opportunities for women expanded dramatically. Universities that had been male-only began admitting women to study law, medicine, engineering, and other professional fields. Women entered the civil service, the judiciary, and private sector professions in numbers that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The Shah's approach to women's rights operated from the same fundamental assumption as his father's controversial 1936 forced unveiling decree, that the state knew better than women themselves or their communities what was good for them, and that modernization could be imposed from above regardless of cultural resistance. The extension of suffrage and professional opportunities to women was real and meaningful for those women who wanted to take advantage of them. But it was also deeply alienating to traditional families who saw these policies as attacks on Islamic values and family structure. The paradox was that many of the women who benefited most from Pahlavi-era reforms in education and professional opportunities would later support the Islamic Revolution that rolled back those very reforms. This seems incomprehensible until one understands that for many Iranians, the question was not simply what rights they had, but who decided and through what process. Rights granted by an authoritarian state that denied basic political freedoms were fundamentally different from rights secured through democratic struggle. Women who attended university and became doctors or lawyers under the Shah often did so while their brothers, fathers, or husbands were being tortured in Savak prisons for political activities. Savak, the Organization of Intelligence and National Security, was the iron fist inside the velvet glove of modernization. It was created in 1958 with direct assistance from the American CIA and Israel's Mossad, who trained its officers in interrogation techniques and counterintelligence methods. Its mission was to identify and neutralize any potential opposition to the Shah's rule. This seems incomprehensible until one understands that for many Iranians, the question was not simply what rights they had, but who decided and through what process. Rights granted by an authoritarian state that denied basic political freedoms were fundamentally different from rights secured through democratic struggle. Women who attended university and became doctors or lawyers under the Shah often did so while their brothers, fathers, or husbands were being tortured in Savak prisons for political activities. Savak, the Organization of Intelligence and National Security, was the iron fist inside the velvet glove of modernization. It was created in 1958 with direct assistance from the American CIA and Israel's Mossad, who trained its officers in interrogation techniques and counterintelligence methods. Its mission was to identify and neutralize any potential opposition to the Shah's rule. SAVAK's methods were not subtle. Political prisoners disappeared into secret detention centers where torture was systematic and methodical. The techniques included sleep deprivation, extended solitary confinement in tiny cells, beatings with cables and batons, electric shocks applied to genitals and other sensitive areas, extraction of fingernails, burning with cigarettes, rape, and forcing prisoners to witness the torture of family members. Some prisoners were strapped to a heated metal bed frame called the grill. Others experienced the kapani, having their arms bound tightly behind their backs and being suspended from the ceiling until joints dislocated. The goal was not just to extract information, but to break the prisoner psychologically, to produce public recantations and force political opponents to confess their crimes on television. Amnesty International estimated that Savak held tens of thousands of political prisoners during the 1970s and documented at least 300 political executions. Torture was routine rather than exceptional. The fear was pervasive among educated Iranians. You did not openly criticize the Shah in private conversation unless you absolutely trusted everyone present. You did not join political organizations or attend unauthorized meetings. This created the central paradox of the White Revolution. Here was a regime that claimed to be modernizing Iran, granting rights, spreading education, liberating women, and building a great civilization. Yet it ruled through systematic torture and political terror. The Shah spoke constantly of human rights and progress while running a police state that crushed any hint of dissent. He sent thousands of students to study at Western universities where they learned about democracy and freedom, then arrested them when they returned to Iran if they showed any sign of wanting to apply those principles. The oil boom of the 1970s transformed this dynamic in important ways. Following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and the subsequent OPEC oil embargo, petroleum prices quadrupled virtually overnight. Iran's oil revenues exploded from under $2 billion in 1972 to over $20 billion by 1975. This sudden influx of wealth created what economists call a rentier state, where the government's revenue came primarily from selling natural resources rather than taxing citizens. A government that taxes its citizens must provide at least some responsiveness to their demands. A government that lives on oil rents need only ensure that the oil keeps flowing. The Shah used this wealth to pursue ever more grandiose projects. He spoke of making Iran the world's fifth industrial power within a generation, of creating a great civilization that would match ancient Persia's glory. Tehran filled with monuments and modern architecture. The military budget soared as the Shah purchased the most advanced weapon systems available from American and European suppliers. Development projects proliferated, often poorly planned and executed, many serving more as showcases than as productive investments. But the wealth also fueled corruption on a spectacular scale. The Shah's court and extended family enriched themselves through kickbacks and insider deals. Ministers and generals did the same. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. In North Tehran, the westernized elite lived in luxury, shopping in boutiques that could have been in Paris or New York, sending their children to American universities, living lives utterly disconnected from the reality of most Iranians.
In South Tehran and the urban slums, the displaced rural migrants and urban poor struggled in poverty, watching the oil wealth that came from their country's resources flow to people who seemed foreign in every sense that mattered.
The Shah himself was driven by a mixture of genuine belief in progress and desperate insecurity about his legitimacy. He seems to have genuinely believed that he was transforming Iran for the better, that the reforms were necessary and beneficial, that the repression was an unfortunate necessity required to maintain stability during rapid change. He could not or would not see that the combination was inherently unstable, that you cannot build a modern free society using police-state methods, that reforms imposed by torture apparatus cannot generate genuine loyalty. The educated middle class that the White Revolution created became one of its most important critics. Young Iranians who attended the expanded universities, who benefited from literacy programs and professional opportunities, became radicalized by the gap between the regime's rhetoric and reality. They could see that political rights meant nothing without genuine democracy, that economic development meant nothing when wealth concentrated at the top, that women's rights meant nothing when everyone lived under dictatorship. Many became Marxists, influenced by leftist theories from Europe and the example of revolutionary movements in Cuba, China, and Vietnam. Others gravitated toward Islamic opposition, finding in religion a framework for resisting Western-backed autocracy. Still others remained liberal Democrats in the tradition of Mossadegh. What united these diverse groups was opposition to the Shah and recognition that his modernization project was fundamentally hollow. The religious opposition, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini from exile in Iraq, articulated a powerful critique that resonated particularly with traditional shopkeepers, small merchants in the bazaars, and the urban poor. Khomeini rejected not just the Shah's political repression, but the entire project of secularization and westernization. He saw land reform as an attack on religious endowments, women's rights as an assault on Islamic family structure, and the literacy corps as a tool for spreading anti-religious propaganda. His vision was not a return to Qajar-era traditionalism, but something new, a fundamentally different relationship between religious authority and political power. The Pahlavi Dynasty's fatal error was believing that you could have modernization without liberalization, development without democracy, rights without representation. The White Revolution was genuinely revolutionary in some of its goals and achievements. Land reform, however flawed in execution, did destroy the old landed aristocracy. Women's rights, however imposed from above, did open opportunities that had not existed before. Literacy programs did educate millions. Economic development did create new industries and infrastructure. But all of it was built on the foundation of a torture state, implemented by decree, dependent on oil wealth and American support, responsive to no one, accountable to no one, legitimate in no one's eyes except its own. By the mid-1970s, Iran was a pressure cooker. The educated class was larger than ever, but completely excluded from power. The religious community was alienated by decades of aggressive secularization. The urban poor were disconnected and angry. Even the military and Savak contained officers who questioned the regime's direction. The only thing holding it together was force, backed by oil money, backed by American support. Remove any one of those supports and the entire structure would collapse. The Shah had succeeded in creating a modern Iran, but he had failed utterly to create an Iran that wanted him to rule it. Chapter 4. Abandoned by America. The Pahlavi Dynasty had been born twice through foreign intervention. Reza Khan's British-backed coup in 1921 brought the dynasty into being. Mohammad Reza Shah's restoration in 1953 was accomplished through a CIA MI6 coup operation. For 54 years, from 1925 to 1979, the dynasty had never stood entirely on its own. It had always required a foreign patron, first Britain, then increasingly the United States, to guarantee its survival. This dependence was not merely financial or military, though American aid certainly propped up the Shah's armed forces and economic programs. The dependence was more fundamental. The dynasty lacked legitimacy in the eyes of its own people, and everyone knew it. What it had instead was power backed by foreign support. When that support was withdrawn, the entire edifice collapsed with a speed that shocked observers around the world. The beginning of the end came not from Iranian revolutionaries, but from Washington, and specifically from the election of Jimmy Carter as President of the United States in November 1976. Carter represented a dramatic shift in American foreign policy thinking. He had campaigned partly on a promise to restore moral purpose to American diplomacy after the cynicism of the Nixon and Ford years, after Vietnam and Watergate, and revelations about CIA operations to overthrow elected governments. Human rights would be central to his foreign policy, he declared. America would no longer support dictators simply because they were anti-communist. The United States would stand with people seeking freedom and democracy, not with autocrats who crushed them. This rhetoric terrified Mohammad Reza Shah. He understood perfectly well that his regime was one of the most egregious human rights violators among American allies. Savak operated torture chambers that were well documented by Amnesty International and other organizations. Political prisoners numbered in the tens of thousands. Executions of dissidents were routine. The entire structure of his rule depended on systematic repression. International pressure had forced some softening of the worst abuses in 1976, but the fundamental apparatus remained intact. If the American government actually applied a human rights standard consistently, the Pahlavi Dynasty would lose its primary international backer. Initially, the Shah hoped that Carter's human rights talk was merely rhetoric that would not affect actual policy towards strategically important allies like Iran. After all, American presidents had been talking about democracy and freedom for decades while supporting dictatorships throughout Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. There was no reason to think Carter would be different. The Shah even attempted to preempt criticism by making some cosmetic improvements, allowing slightly more press freedom and permitting the International Red Cross limited access to some prisons. But Carter proved more serious about human rights than the Shah had anticipated. In 1977, the State Department began publicly criticizing Iran's human rights record in official reports. American diplomats raised the issue of political prisoners in meetings with Iranian officials. Most consequentially, the implicit understanding that had existed since 1953 that America would support the Shah regardless of his domestic policies as long as he remained aligned with American strategic interests began to fray. The Shah could feel the ground shifting beneath his throne. The Iranian opposition sensed this shift as well. If the Americans were questioning their support for the Shah, perhaps he was vulnerable in ways he had not been before. Throughout 1977, various opposition groups began testing the limits of what they could get away with. Intellectuals and writers issued open letters demanding political freedom. Students organized demonstrations at universities. Labor strikes broke out at factories. Each time the regime responded with force, and each time the international attention and American criticism grew louder. The Shah found himself in an impossible position. If he cracked down hard on protests, he would confirm every accusation of human rights abuses and risk losing American support entirely. But if he showed restraint and allowed dissent to grow, he would appear weak and encourage more opposition. He oscillated between these approaches, sometimes ordering Savak to arrest protest leaders, sometimes instructing security forces to show restraint, never committing fully to either strategy. This indecision was itself a sign of weakness that the opposition noted carefully. The royal family was divided in how to respond to the growing crisis. Ashraf, the Shah's twin sister, had always been the more ruthless and politically astute of the two. She urged her brother to crush the opposition immediately and decisively, to stop worrying about American opinion and do whatever was necessary to maintain power. She argued that weakness would only invite more challenges, that the opposition respected only force.
But Empress Farah, the Shah's third wife, took a different view. She had cultivated a more liberal image through her patronage of arts and culture, and she believed that genuine reforms might diffuse the opposition while preserving the monarchy in a constitutional form. The Shah listened to both, but could not commit to either course, paralyzed by indecision. In August 1978, a fire at the Cinema Rex in the city of Abadan killed over 400 people. The opposition immediately blamed Savak, claiming the regime had set the fire to terrorize the population. The regime blamed religious extremists trying to punish moviegoers for attending a sinful establishment. To this day, the truth of who started the fire remains disputed, but what mattered politically was that most Iranians believed the regime was responsible. The Cinema Rex fire became a turning point, transforming simmering discontent into mass rage. Protests that had been limited to students and intellectuals now spread to the broader population.
On September 8, 1978, the crisis reached a critical moment. It was the holy month of Muharram, and protesters had called for mass demonstrations across Iran despite a recently declared martial law. In Tehran, thousands gathered in Jala Square. Troops from the Imperial Guard, many of them Kurdish conscripts who spoke little Persian, received orders to disperse the crowds. When the protesters refused to leave, the troops opened fire. The official accounting would later establish that 64 people were killed in Jala Square itself, with another 30 dying in other parts of the capital, bringing the total to 94 dead. Opposition sources claimed hundreds or even thousands had died. The perceived truth mattered more than the documented reality. Iranians called it Black Friday, and it convinced many that the regime had declared war on its own people. The Shah was not in Tehran when the Jala Square massacre happened. He had been suffering from cancer, a fact he had hidden not only from the Iranian public, but from most of his own government, and even from the CIA. His medical condition was affecting his judgment and his ability to respond to the crisis with clarity and decisiveness. He seemed increasingly detached from events, spending hours in his palace watching events unfold on television rather than actively directing government response. The American government was growing alarmed. Intelligence assessments from the CIA station in Tehran were chaotic and contradictory. Some analysts believed the protests were a temporary disturbance that the Shah's security forces could contain. Others saw the beginnings of genuine revolution that might overthrow the monarchy entirely. The American ambassador, William Sullivan, was sending increasingly urgent cables to Washington warning that the situation was deteriorating rapidly and that the United States needed to decide whether it would support the Shah militarily if he faced an existential threat. In January 1979, the leaders of the major Western powers met at the Guadeloupe Conference in the French Caribbean. President Carter was joined by French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, British Prime Minister James Callaghan, and West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. Iran was high on the agenda. The European leaders believed the Shah's position was untenable and that the West should prepare for whatever government would replace him. They argued that trying to save the monarchy militarily would be futile and would poison relations with whatever regime emerged from the revolution. Carter, influenced by his national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, was more inclined to support the Shah, but he faced opposition from his own State Department, which believed accommodation with the opposition was the only viable path. The outcome of Guadeloupe was a consensus that the Western powers would not intervene militarily to save the Shah. They would not stage another 1953-style coup. They would not send troops or support a military crackdown. They would encourage the Shah to reach a political settlement with moderate opposition figures, to perhaps establish a constitutional monarchy, or even leave the country temporarily while a transitional government was formed. In essence, the Western leaders who met in Guadeloupe decided that Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was expendable. After 26 years of being America's policeman in the Persian Gulf, after billions of dollars in American weapons purchases, after serving as a bulwark against Soviet influence, the Shah learned that, when it came down to it, he could not count on the allies who had sustained his throne.
The Shah heard reports of the Guadeloupe decisions and was devastated. Brzezinski attempted to reassure him in phone calls and through emissaries that the United States still supported him. But the contradiction between words and actions was obvious. If America truly supported him, it would give clear signals that it would back a military crackdown on the opposition. Instead, American officials were meeting with opposition leaders and talking about transitions and political settlements. The Shah understood these signals perfectly. He was being told to leave.
On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and Empress Farah left Iran. The official statement said the Shah was taking a brief vacation for health reasons and would return soon. No one believed it. Huge crowds celebrated in the streets of Tehran, tearing down statues of Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah, burning effigies, dancing and shouting with joy. The man who had ruled Iran for 37 years, who had spoken of building a great civilization and making Iran a world power, fled his capital in an aircraft filled with luggage and personal possessions, heading first to Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat offered temporary asylum. The Shah's departure revealed just how hollow his power had been. The military he had spent billions building immediately began to disintegrate. Soldiers deserted in massive numbers. Generals who had commanded divisions melted away. The Savak operatives who had terrorized the population for decades went into hiding or fled the country. None of the institutions the Shah had built proved capable of surviving his physical absence. There was no deep reservoir of loyalty, no party structure to maintain power, no true believers willing to fight for the dynasty. It had all been a facade, held together only by the Shah's personal authority, backed by American support. And when both were withdrawn, nothing remained. The Americans who had backed the Shah through successive administrations bore direct responsibility for the dynasty's character and ultimate failure. They had rescued it in 1953 and sustained it for a quarter century afterward with military aid, economic support, and political cover. But American support came with no requirement for genuine political reform or democratization. As long as the Shah bought American weapons, opposed communism, and kept oil flowing, American administrations from Eisenhower through Ford had been content to overlook torture, repression, and corruption. This created a regime that was strong enough to suppress opposition, but never legitimate enough to govern without suppression. When Carter's human rights policy signaled even partial withdrawal of unconditional support, the entire structure began to crumble. The Shah himself must bear the largest responsibility. He had every advantage: oil wealth beyond imagination, a powerful military, control of all state institutions, international backing. He could have used these advantages to build genuinely popular support through real democratic reforms, through addressing inequality, through creating space for opposition to express itself peacefully. Instead, he chose repression and autocracy, convinced that he knew better than his people what was good for them, certain that force could substitute for legitimacy indefinitely. His cancer-weakened indecisiveness in 1978 and 1979 was not the cause of his fall, but merely the final manifestation of deeper failures that stretched back decades. The British had created the dynasty as a solution to their strategic problems in the early 20th century, needing a strong centralized Iran that could resist Soviet encroachment while protecting British oil interests. But they never created institutions that could survive without foreign backing. They created a personal autocracy dressed in the costume of monarchy. When the Americans inherited the role of patron, they perpetuated the same dependency, while the Shah convinced himself that American weapons and development aid were making him genuinely powerful rather than artificially sustained. The Pahlavi dynasty had lasted 54 years, from December 1925 to February 1979. It had survived World War, occupation, and political crisis. It had overseen Iran's modernization and transformation from a backward agricultural society to an oil-rich developing country.
It had left a mixed legacy of real development alongside brutal repression, of women's advancement alongside political torture, of grand ambitions alongside spectacular corruption. But it had never solved the fundamental problem that had plagued it from its founding. It had never been legitimate in the eyes of the people it ruled. It had been created by foreign powers for foreign purposes, sustained by foreign support, and when that support was withdrawn, it vanished almost overnight. The throne that had seemed so solid, so permanent, so powerful, turned out to be an empty chair that no one was willing to defend once the Shah abandoned it.
Chapter 5. The unlikely revolutionary coalition that toppled the throne. Khomeini's Islamists, Marxist guerrillas, liberal Democrats, and traditional Bazaris united against the Shah. When Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's airplane lifted off from Mehrabad Airport on January 16, 1979, it created a vacuum that filled immediately with celebration, and then, more ominously, with competition over who would fill the empty throne. The streets of Tehran erupted in joy. Statues of both Pahlavi Shahs were torn down and smashed. Pictures of the royal family were ripped from walls and burned. Crowds danced and chanted and wept with relief. But among the celebrating masses were distinct groups with radically different visions of what should come next, groups that agreed on absolutely nothing except that the Pahlavi dynasty had to end. The most visible and ultimately dominant force was the Islamist movement led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, from his exile in the Iraqi holy city of Najaf, and later from a village outside Paris. Khomeini was 76 years old in 1979, a cleric who had spent decades in obscurity studying Islamic jurisprudence, before emerging as a fiery critic of the Shah's regime in the early 1960s. His opposition had not been tactical or limited to specific policies. It was total and theological. He rejected the entire Pahlavi project of secularization and westernization as fundamentally un-Islamic, as a betrayal of Iran's identity and values.
What made Khomeini particularly dangerous to the regime was his theory of velayat-e-faqih, governance by the supreme Islamic jurist. This was not traditional Shia thinking. For centuries, the Shia clergy had mostly stayed out of direct political rule, preferring to maintain moral authority while letting secular rulers handle the messy business of governance. Khomeini argued that this separation was wrong, that in the absence of the hidden imam, qualified clerics had not just the right but the duty to rule. This was revolutionary theology that transformed opposition to the Shah into a religious obligation. Khomeini's followers were diverse but shared certain characteristics. Many were traditional middle class, the Bazari merchants who ran the covered markets that had been the commercial heart of Iranian cities for centuries. These merchants resented economic policies that favored modern industry and large corporations over traditional small-scale commerce. They saw the influx of Western consumer goods and Western business practices as threats to their livelihoods. But their opposition was also cultural and religious. The bazaar had always been closely linked to the mosque, with merchants funding religious institutions and clerics blessing commercial transactions. The Pahlavi drive to secularize society threatened this symbiotic relationship.
The Bazaris proved crucial to the revolution because they could organize and fund resistance in ways that other groups could not. When the call came for general strikes to paralyze the economy and bring down the regime, it was the bazaar that shut down commerce across Iran. Shop after shop closed. Goods stopped flowing. The commercial heart of the country stopped beating, and with it went much of the regime's claim to be providing prosperity and stability. Alongside the Islamists were the Marxist guerrilla organizations, groups with names like the Mojahedin-e-Khalq and the Fedayeen-e-Khalq. These were young, educated, often from middle-class backgrounds, radicalized by the gap between Iran's oil wealth and the poverty they saw around them. They had been inspired by revolutionary movements worldwide, from Cuba to Vietnam to Algeria, and they believed that armed struggle was the only way to overthrow the regime.
Throughout the 1970s, they had carried out assassinations of Savak agents, bombings of government buildings, and attacks on American military advisors in Iran.
The Marxist guerrillas brought something that the other opposition groups lacked: a willingness and capability to use violence. They had weapons, military training, and most importantly, martyrs whose deaths in gun battles with Savak or whose executions after show trials had made them heroes to disaffected youth. University students plastered campuses with posters of guerrillas who had been killed, turning them into secular saints of the resistance. The guerrillas' ideology was explicitly socialist, calling for the overthrow of the monarchy, the nationalization of industry, and the creation of a worker state. This put them in fundamental conflict with both the Islamists who wanted theocracy and the liberals who wanted democracy. The liberal Democrats were the heirs of Mohammad Mossadegh's National Front, intellectuals and professionals who wanted constitutional government, rule of law, and an end to dictatorship. Many were lawyers, professors, journalists, and civil servants who had seen their political space crushed after 1953, but had never abandoned hope for a democratic Iran. They were not revolutionaries by temperament. They wanted reform through legal and peaceful means, a return to the constitutional principles of 1906, a monarchy that reigned but did not rule, or perhaps no monarchy at all, but a republic based on popular sovereignty.
The Liberal Democrats' weakness was that they had no mass base and no capacity for violent resistance. They could write manifestos and give speeches, but they could not organize general strikes like the Bazaris or fight security forces like the Marxist guerrillas. What they offered instead was legitimacy and international respectability. Many had studied at Western universities and maintained connections with intellectual circles abroad. They could articulate the opposition's demands in terms that made sense to foreign audiences, and differentiate the movement from mere chaos or extremism. Then there were the masses, the millions of ordinary Iranians who were not members of any organized group, but who poured into the streets when the moment came. Many were the displaced rural poor who had migrated to cities after land reform destroyed traditional village life. They lived in the slums of South Tehran and similar areas in other cities, working in construction or as street vendors or day laborers when they could find work at all. They had been uprooted from everything familiar, promised prosperity through modernization, and given poverty and dislocation instead. For them, the revolution was not primarily about political theory or religious governance or democratic principles. It was about anger at visible injustice, at the sight of the wealthy elite in North Tehran living in luxury while they struggled to feed their families, at the humiliation of being treated as backward and ignorant by a regime that claimed to be civilizing them. When Khomeini spoke in his recorded messages from exile, his words resonated with these masses not because of theological sophistication, but because of raw emotional power. He told them their suffering was not their fault, that they were not the problem, that the Shah and his foreign backers were the problem. He gave them permission to be angry and told them that anger was righteous. What united this impossibly diverse coalition was not shared ideology, but shared enemy. The Shah's great achievement in repression had been to alienate virtually every sector of Iranian society except the tiny elite directly dependent on his patronage. He had given each group its own reasons to hate his regime. The clerics hated the forced secularization and attacks on religious institutions. The Bazaris hated the economic policies that threatened their livelihoods. The Marxists hated the alliance with American imperialism and the savage repression of labor organizing. The liberals hated the destruction of constitutional government and the mockery of democracy. The poor hated the visible inequality and their own immiseration. The educated middle class hated the suffocating intellectual atmosphere and the torture of anyone who dared think differently.
The genius of the revolutionary movement was recognizing that these groups could work together for the limited purpose of removing the Shah, postponing until later the inevitable conflicts over what would replace him.
The liberal Democrat Mehdi Bazargan could appear on the same platform with Islamist clerics, despite having completely different visions of Iran's future. Marxist guerrillas could participate in demonstrations organized by mosques, even though their ideology was explicitly atheist. Bazaar merchants could fund strikes organized by leftist labor unions. Everyone agreed to disagree later, but first the dynasty had to fall. The revolution itself was remarkably non-violent compared to what might have been expected. There were moments of bloodshed, like the Jaleh Square massacre, but there were no pitched battles between insurgents and the military, no protracted civil war, no prolonged siege of the capital. Instead, the revolution worked through mass demonstrations, general strikes, and the gradual disintegration of regime authority. Millions of people would take to the streets, overwhelming security forces by sheer numbers. When troops were ordered to fire on crowds, increasingly they refused or fired over their heads. Soldiers began deserting in massive numbers, some joining the revolutionary side, others simply disappearing back to their villages.
The oil workers' strike in the fall of 1978 was perhaps the single most devastating blow to the regime. Oil was Iran's lifeline, the source of the revenue that funded everything. When the workers at the refineries and oil fields walked off their jobs, they did not just inconvenience the government, they starved it of resources. The Shah could not pay the military if oil revenues dried up. He could not maintain patronage networks or subsidize loyalists. The strike demonstrated that all the Shah's power ultimately rested on the willingness of ordinary people to cooperate with the system, and when they refused to cooperate, the power evaporated. Khomeini's role throughout this period was to provide ideological cohesion and strategic direction from afar. His messages were smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes that were duplicated and distributed through mosque networks. People would gather in homes or religious spaces to listen to these recordings, to hear the Ayatollah's gravelly voice telling them to continue resisting, to not compromise, to not accept half measures. He was inflexible in a way that the other opposition leaders were not. When some advocated negotiating with the regime for a transitional government that would preserve some role for the monarchy, Khomeini rejected it absolutely. The Pahlavi Dynasty was illegitimate and had to go entirely. There could be no compromise with it.
This inflexibility proved to be politically astute. The Shah and his remaining advisors kept hoping to split the opposition, to peel off moderates by offering concessions while isolating and crushing radicals. But if Khomeini would not negotiate and the masses followed his lead, then the moderates had little room to maneuver. Anyone who accepted a compromise risked being denounced as a traitor to the revolution. So the coalition held together, radicalized by its most uncompromising member. The Pahlavi family's response to the revolutionary crisis revealed the hollowness at the dynasty's core. Empress Farah later recounted feeling completely isolated during those final months, watching her husband grow increasingly withdrawn and indecisive as his cancer progressed. She wanted him to reach out to moderate opposition figures, to perhaps save the monarchy by transforming it into something genuinely constitutional. But the Shah could not bring himself to do it. To negotiate with the opposition would mean admitting that his entire approach had been wrong, that the authoritarian modernization, the Savak repression, the great civilization rhetoric had all failed. His pride would not permit it. Princess Ashraf had fled Iran earlier, reading the situation clearly enough to know that as one of the most hated members of the royal family, she would be among the first targets if the regime fell. Other princes and princesses began leaving as well, taking with them whatever wealth they could carry. The exodus of the royal family in the final months became its own story, a stampede of privileged people abandoning the sinking ship, proving to any doubters that they had never really believed in the greatness they had claimed to be building. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran after nearly 15 years in exile. His arrival at Mehrabad Airport drew crowds estimated in the millions.
The scenes were extraordinary. People climbing onto rooftops and telephone poles to catch a glimpse of him. Flowers thrown at his motorcade. Grown men weeping at the sight of the old cleric they had never met, but whose voice on cassette tapes had sustained them through years of repression. Khomeini himself seemed unmoved by the adulation. When asked by a journalist how he felt about returning to Iran, he replied with one word: nothing. It was a telling response. For Khomeini, this was not a personal triumph, but the inevitable working out of divine will. The military's final collapse came quickly. On February 9th, clashes broke out between units of the Imperial Guard, still loyal to the absent Shah, and Air Force technicians who had declared for the revolution. The fighting escalated, and other military units began choosing sides. By February 11th, it was over. The military command announced on radio that they would remain neutral and return to their barracks. It was an elegant way of saying they had given up. Without the military's support, the last remnants of the Pahlavi regime dissolved. Government buildings were taken over by revolutionary committees. Savak headquarters was stormed and burned. Political prisoners were released from Evin prison. The revolution had succeeded.
What made this revolutionary coalition succeed where previous opposition movements had failed? Part of the answer lies in the Pahlavi dynasty's own contradictions. Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah had destroyed the old power structures, the Qajar aristocracy and the tribal confederations, but had created nothing sustainable to replace them except personal autocracy. They had modernized Iran's economy and society, but had created in that very process the social groups most opposed to autocracy. An educated middle class that demanded political rights. An urban working class that demanded economic justice. A displaced rural poor with nothing to lose. The dynasty had also become completely dependent on foreign support in ways that the Qajar dynasty, for all its weakness, had never been. When the British and Americans withdrew that support in 1978 and 1979, the Pahlavis had no domestic foundation to fall back on. They had spent decades teaching Iranians that the throne existed because foreigners wanted it to exist. When foreigners stopped wanting it, the throne collapsed. The revolutionary coalition of 1979 succeeded because it was broad enough to represent the overwhelming majority of Iranian society against a regime that represented only itself and its foreign patrons. Students and merchants, workers and clerics, Marxists and Muslims, men and women, all found their own reasons to demand change. The Pahlavi dynasty had made itself so comprehensively hated that overthrowing it required no complicated political strategy, only the willingness to stand up simultaneously and refuse to cooperate any longer. The dynasty that had come to power through a British-backed military coup in 1921 ended in revolutionary upheaval in 1979. The throne that Reza Khan had seized by marching troops into Tehran was lost when his son fled Tehran on an airplane, abandoned by the American patrons who had sustained it for a quarter century. The Pahlavi experiment in authoritarian modernization, in forced secularization, in building a great civilization through decree and violence had failed utterly. Within weeks, Iran would be declared an Islamic republic. The monarchy that had ruled Iran in various forms for over 2,000 years since the Achaemenids and Parthians and Sasanians was gone, and the people danced in the streets. The Pahlavi dynasty's rise and fall offers a stark lesson in the limits of imposed modernization. For 54 years, two Shahs attempted to transform Iran through authoritarian decree, backed by foreign powers rather than popular legitimacy. They built universities and industries, granted women's rights, and pursued land reform, yet relied on torture and repression to silence opposition. The fundamental contradiction proved fatal. You cannot build a free modern society using police-state methods. When American support wavered in 1978, the entire structure collapsed within months, revealing that all the grand palaces and military hardware had been built on sand.
The diverse coalition that overthrew the dynasty, from Islamists to Marxists to liberals, agreed on nothing except that foreign-backed autocracy had to end. Their revolution would create its own problems, but it decisively answered one question. Legitimacy cannot be purchased with oil wealth or borrowed from foreign patrons. It must be earned from the governed. Thank you for listening.